Future Podcast.
Hey, Feudal Future family. Today's episode is a special episode. This is a clip from Joel Kotkin from his recent event at Chapman University, Views from the Left Coast. Joel will be speaking about the urban future. Enjoy.
Let's get started. Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to Chapman University. I'm the Dean of the Argo School of Business and Economics here at Chapman University. I've been on the job only a couple of months. I came back to California in August to help lead the school to new heights. And super excited to be here today with you and have such a fantastic panel of speakers to talk about the topic of the future of cities. So the United States, the western part of the United States, have traditionally taken an important role in shaping how cities in the US more generally are developing and evolving and so on. And now we see some challenges to that. We have significant homelessness. We have significant increases in home prices, a lot of challenges. And how do we address those challenges and how do we move forward? That's what our panelists will talk about today. And I'm very happy to say that the first person I will introduce here is my good friend, Joel Kotkin, who is one of our presidential fellows. He also holds the Roger Hobbs Fellowship, Professorship in Urban Studies here at Chapman University, and had the chance to interact with Joel many times during his visit here, and he's providing a lot of thought leadership for us. So it's good to have you here, Joel. Brian Streeter is over here, and he's the State Farm James Q. Wilson Scholar and also the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. It's so great to have you here. Wonderful introduction meeting we had earlier today, and we're so happy about the sponsorship that AEI also is providing for the conference. So it's great to have you here. We have Natalie Gochnour, who is here, who's coming in from Utah. She's the Associate Dean at the David Eccles School of Business and also the Director of the Kemsey Gardner Policy Institute at the University of Utah. So pleased to have you here as well as a Associate Dean, as a Director. It's great to have you here and listen to your perspective. We have Karla López welcome to you as well, who is a Community Development Executive and also a Principal at Connections Consulting. So it's great to have your perspective here today as well. Last but definitely not least, we have also our friend Charles Blain here, who is the President of Urban Reform and the Urban Reform Institute, coming here from Texas, and that will provide another perspective as well for us. So with those introductory remarks, let me hand it over to our guests here. So Joel, you're going to start by giving a few remarks, and then we will open up so all of you guys can ask some questions for the panel. But we will have each of the panelists first talk a little bit to you guys. So Joel, you go first. All right.
Thanks, Henrik. Thanks everybody for being here. You know, in this weird era that we're in, getting people to show up live really come up a major challenge. And I'm so pleased that you're all here. The book, which was put together by AEI, I think really talks about some of the real changes that are going on. Some of it driven by the pandemic, but what I'm going to try talking about is that the pandemic only accelerated what was already happening. And I think it did speed up the technological revolution that I think is also going to shape cities in the future. So I want to just share a few things here. Ibn Khaldun, if you haven't read him, an Arab historian of the 14th century, said a lot of smart things. And actually, if you go into this amazing period of Islamic history, they had these people who traveled all over the world and wrote up their commentaries. So when I want to find out some things about happening in certain parts of the world in the 14th, 15th century, I know you're probably not interested, but the reality is that he had some great ideas. And he said, when there is a general change of condition, it is as if the entire creation had changed and the whole world altered. And I think that's what we're going through. Some of it is long-standing, it's technological, it's demographic, And it also has to do with what some of the big changes in the world where, and we deal with this in the book. We have chapters that deal with cities in Africa. We have chapters in the book about the cities in China. So a lot of these things are applicable on a global level. Now, this is just most of the things will be U.S., but one of the things that always drove me a little bit nuts when I'm reading the media is they think everybody's moving back into the city. Everybody's going to be in these dense cities. The denser, the better. And meanwhile, my colleague Wendell Cox and others have been saying, well, how about looking at the census, like looking at the numbers? But as I remember when I was debating somebody on CNN about the future of cities and and I asked one, I said, well, why do you think people hate suburbs? I said, well, all my friends in Greenwich Village hate suburbs. I said, well, okay, that's a really good sample. Anyway, so what we're seeing is that cities are actually becoming less dense almost everywhere in the world. One of the things that happened in the past, particularly, is that business centers were and offices were built in the areas where the old neighborhoods were. So that, like if you go to Beijing, for instance, the areas that used to be filled with residential neighborhoods are now office buildings and have sort of displaced. The same thing's true in Tokyo. So what we see is that most cities are much less crowded than they once were. You look at Paris, you look at New York. New York, one time the Lower East Side was the densest place on the planet around 1900. Why my grandparents went there. Tell me that was probably better than Russia. But the reality is, what's happened is a universal movement. Even when cities in the developing world are growing, they're growing at the outskirts. And I think there are lots of reasons for this, but I think this is accelerating. And oddly enough, the one place that's gotten a little denser is the Los Angeles region, because we started off as much less dense and now much denser. But the reality is the urban density around the world is changing, and people are spreading out, and of course we get reasons. But I just want to show you some numbers here. This is the net domestic migration core versus suburbs. And what you can see is there was a brief period, basically around 2012, where urban growth and the growth in the suburbs was almost even. And then you can see what happened, and you can see what happened in 2020. But the long-term trend is pretty clear. Has a lot to do with cost of housing, has to do with increasingly with the issue of public safety. It has to do with the fact that work can be now dispersed much more. If you think about what's happening Charles is our Texas expert, but one of the things that's clear is companies now feel, even high-end business service companies, say they can locate into North Dallas and serve the whole country. They don't have to be different in one or two or three of the major cities. So they're both dispersing in different cities and to the suburbs of those cities. For instance, in Houston, I probably shouldn't talk about it, but I will. In Houston, Charles and I were talking about the city of Houston. We think of it as a boom town, but it's actually losing population. And even Harris County, which is the county surrounding the city of Houston, is about stagnant. But there's very rapid growth in the counties around. But increasingly, what people are finding is they're making the choice for many reasons. Now, a lot of it's demographics. As people get older, they start families, they want to buy a house, they really can't do it in the urban core. So this is basically a long-run trend. So if we take a look, another way is if you look at the 52 largest metro areas, you can see that they've lost population every year since 2016 in terms of net domestic migration. Now, in the past, and I'll get into this a little bit later, the immigrants came and sort of made up for the fact that the local residents were leaving. But now what we're seeing is the immigrants are figuring out that they want the suburbs too. And what you see is one of the things I always get a kick out of is and Karla's takeaway places. There are great Mexican restaurants in the Inland Empire. There are the best Vietnamese food in America is in Orange County. And so I think we're seeing a huge change in the nature of suburban growth. And again, it's driven by domestic migration, but what we're also seeing is immigrants are choosing to go to cities that are generally less dense. Like just one interesting thing, the biggest increases in immigration were in Miami, the growth of the foreign-born population, and Dallas and Houston, and Los Angeles actually lost foreign-born population in the last decade. So what's happened more recently, and we again can't be always sure that is the going to be the long-term pattern, but San Jose and San Francisco, and I think in fact I think Google announced 10,000 layoffs today. That's probably not going to help the demographics. And what we're seeing is the cities that were most built, particularly San Francisco and New York, which were really built on this idea of what Gene Gottman wrote about the transactional city, where the future of the city was high-end business crowded into central districts. And many cities have done that. But those that have been most dependent are having the hardest time. San Francisco in particular, crime, all the things that Henrik was mentioning, crime, homelessness, friends might say, well, never take your car to San Francisco because it's going to get broken into. The cops aren't going to do anything about it. Well, that's not a great recommendation. Los Angeles, if you've been to downtown LA, not a pretty picture. And I always wonder, like, if I had a company, would I want my employees to have to be in an environment filled with homeless people? And particularly, I would think for the female workers, a particular problem, getting harassed and things like that. So what we're seeing, generally speaking, is that people are leaving high crime and also very much high density areas. And what's happened is that people now are able to work more remotely. So let's say in New York City, where people used to be 5 days a week going into Manhattan, and you can tell that's my hometown, people going into Manhattan, maybe they're coming in once, maybe they're coming in not at all. So let's say if your job is in downtown LA and you only have to come in once a week, you're more likely to say, hey, you know what, I'm going to move further out in the Inland Empire, or I'm going to move, to Palm Springs. I'm going to move somewhere I want to be, and still, hold on to my job. So we're really in this, as Ibn Khaldun said, we're really in this major historic change. Where it ends up, I can't tell you, but I do think that we're going into an era of much greater dispersion of economic and demographic poverty. And one of the big things that, of course, is that people say, well, I remember this from years ago, young people aren't interested in housing. They don't want to have a backyard. That the new generation wants to live in a high density, high intense environment. Now, that is somewhat true up until the age of 30. And then that changes almost completely. There are some people, Dr. Woody Allen types who have to be in New York because they couldn't survive anywhere else. But the reality is most people, take a look at millennials, about 16% want a single family. Well, you try to get a single family home in an urban setting, particularly when you have cities who are essentially saying, if you live in a single family home in a urban area, we're going to densify it and you're not going to be able to have what you want. So we've got some great urban neighborhoods around the country, in Los Angeles and other cities that are under assault by developers and planners who are sort of trying to destroy that single family neighborhood culture, and that accelerates it as well. So this was what I thought one of the really amazing statistics. And then this is pre-pandemic. And as you can see, Miami, which is the whole Miami-Dade area, was the largest place for an increase in the number of foreign-born people. Then Dallas, then Houston, both ahead of New York, which is the traditional center of where people go. And now we have Mayor Adams saying that can't take any more of the undocumented who have been crossing the border. For a mayor of New York to be unable to accommodate 50,000 people, it's pretty bad. Anyway, so the bottom line is that foreign-born are also dispersed, and they're dispersing predominantly to fairly low-density cities, and that's been pretty much the case over the last 10 years. And then the other thing that the suburbs have changed. So the vast majority of all the growth in the suburbs of the United States in the last 20 years has been among Hispanics, African Americans, Asians. 4% of the growth in suburban life is from white non-Hispanics. So I one day I hate Twitter, but I wrote an article where I was talking about these things. They said, well, it showed that the fact that he thinks it's something which is a good show that they're racist. So, can I be a racist if I'm talking about places where minorities are moving? And yet, we unfortunately a lot of particularly people in academia and the media don't understand that this is 2023 and not 19. And this is a major change that's taking place. And what you find increasingly is that the great concentrations of immigrants are now in the suburbs. The most diverse county in the United States, Fort Bend County, outside of Houston. And it's just an amazing place with basically a quarter African American, a quarter Hispanic, a quarter Asian, a quarter white. It also has an enormous Indian town, a good place for Indian food. But the reality is that this is where America is going. And my point is that just because people live in the suburbs doesn't mean that they don't live in the city. They live in a different kind of city. And what's exciting about it is these cities are beginning to evolve. And if you want to just see a really good example of where suburbia is going, just walk down to the circle area here in orange, which basically gives you a lot of the good things of the urban experience without a lot of the bad. And I was very happy that my kids could go to the circle instead of going to the coast. And I think what you're seeing is more and more of these suburban communities are building some sort of urban infrastructure. Include, I think there's going to be greater competition from suburbs, smaller cities. Some people say that's anti-urban. Frank Lloyd Wright said, "The city is where the citizens go." And I think people who live in Orange are part of the Los Angeles region. We're just as much a part of it as somebody who lives down. Some cities like New York may try to be a luxury city. But it's going to have more and more competition and more people moving to other areas. And I've seen a lot of new cultural institutions growing, for instance, in Westchester County, New York, where a lot of people have moved as they moved out of the city. And if you've been to the Hudson Valley, it's one of the great places in North America. But even New York has got a lot of competition. Some cities like Chicago, I think, are challenged because their weather's worse. Their crime is worse, and their city government is even more. Because LA is trying to catch up. I think that people talk about the suburbs are bad for the environment, but the reality is, if people live and work either at home or nearby, they're actually using a lot less gas, a lot less power. And they actually can be quite good. And again, many of the really interesting suburban developments I've seen, with Woodlands being a good example outside of Houston, or even we just take a look at Irvine. It's a very environmentally friendly area, and a place where there's a great deal of efficiency. By the way, Irvine has the highest rates of working at home and the shortest commutes of almost any. And that has to do with the fact that this was very well planned. So, but the poor cities have to realize that they've got real competition, and they're going to have to change their approach. I think one of the problems cities is it's all been about grandiosity and we're the center of the universe, and so everybody has to be here. It's like, remember Bloomberg saying, "Well, New York is where you have to be successful." And I said, I think there's a bunch of guys outside of San Jose did pretty well. So the reality is that success can be pursued and can move from place to place. So we're in an era of intense competition, and the key thing I think the city, and I'm sure Ryan has some comments on this too, is you got to deal with the crime issue. You got to deal with the school issue. You've got to deal with the sanitation issue. And cities want to do everything but that. They want stadia for professional sports teams. They want to build high-rise luxury apartments for people who are there 2 days a year. But the reality is you got to get back to basics. And the key thing is crime and schools and the basic infrastructure. And right now, I don't see a lot of discussion in that direction. Hopefully, our book will nudge people in that direction. So anyway, that's to get us started. And Ryan?